Hi folks, welcome to another episode of Naturally Healthy. I'm Dr. Craig Steingraber here at the Summit Healthplex, and I'm glad you're with us. Today's topic is going to be about a major portion of our brain. In previous issues, or episodes I should say, we've talked about mainly how nerve signals are inputted into our body and eventually travel up to our brain. There are different regions in our brain proper, so to speak, that are stimulated based on some of that input, or based on all of that input, quite frankly. And as I was getting prepared for this show and for other shows relative to this section of the brain, I realized there's no way that I could do you and the brain justice by capsulizing it all into one show. So today, I'm going to generalize certain areas of our brain, give you different locations where different aspects of function go on, so you can have a better appreciation about how the brain is so individualized and different and compartmentalized. And we're going to eventually tie all that together on how those different areas and compartments talk to each other. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And in the coming episodes, I'm going to break down each specific region of the part of the brain called the cortex. And you're really going to get an appreciation for how in-depth and how intricate our brain is, and why in reality, if we take care of anything, we really should take care of how our brain functions and how it's fed. Now, having said how it's fed, what I want to touch base on is just a kind of brief review of some of the other shows that we've done to lay that little foundation, because that's going to be a major part of us tying in how we can stimulate and create a healthier brain. Now, in previous shows, we talked about the many different types of receptors or nerves that are throughout our body. Nerves that transmit pain, nerves that transmit vibrations, nerves that transmit hot, warm, cool, cold, nerves that transmit movement, many different types of nerves, nerves that transmit light, smell or odor, taste, nerves in our inner ear that have to do with movement and position as well. And when those nerves are stimulated in whatever way, that stimulus immediately turns into electricity, which then travels up a nerve, or think of it as a wire, and eventually ends up in our brain. We talked about the different sections of the spinal cord that is our spinal vertebrae or bones surround and protect. We talked about the different sections of that spinal cord and how some information or electricity regarding some of those different types of sensations go up that spinal cord and eventually meet in the brain. We talked about the lower part, a very old part of our brain called the brain stem, where we have a lot of unconscious activity and directive activity going on. For cardiac or heart function, you don't consciously make your heart beat. For breathing and many other types of primitive kind of reflexes and function. Well, we're going to start going higher up into the brain now. And in the end, as I mentioned, we're going to capsulize how all these stimuli, light, odor, taste, movement, sound, how those stimuli can affect these certain types of brain regions and create a healthier brain, which creates a healthier us and healthier body. Now, generally speaking, there is 3 different brain regions of this area of our brain called the cortex, the higher brain. There's one called the neocortex, which is the really new brain. And that is a part of the brain that really separates us as human beings from all other animals and mammals. That part of our brain, the newer brain, has a lot to do with thinking about what we're supposed to do, our personalities, inhibiting or stopping things we know we shouldn't do. And we'll get into that part of the brain in other shows. But then we have an area called the paleocortex and one called the archicortex. And as you go down from neo is newest, paleo's not as new, but somewhat new, and then the archicortex is an older part of the brain. We'll get into that later and not use some of those words either and put them into easier terms to understand. But generally speaking, many of you may have heard of or are aware of the basic aspects of our cortical brain, called the lobes of our brain. The figure you see on the screen right now, it has 4 different regions, general regions of the brain. One being the frontal lobe, which you see flashing now. That is a lot of that is a very new part of our brain. A lot of the executive functions and the specifics of inhibiting things or inhibiting actions that we know that we shouldn't do, morals, personality, a lot of that kind of stuff is in there. Other things which we'll talk about later. The second area that's flashing is called the parietal lobe or parietal cortex. Generally speaking, that has a lot to do with what we actually feel. Touch, vibration, different things like that. This next area that's flashing is called the temporal lobe. Generally speaking, that is an area where we have a lot of aspects of hearing, different aspects of taste, different aspects of language, comprehension of language, many other aspects, and we'll get into that on another show as well. All these areas are extremely, extremely interesting. The last one that you see flashing is called the occipital lobe. Generally speaking, a lot of aspects of sight go on in that area. Within each of these lobes, we have 4 of those on the left and 4 of those on the right. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. If we took something and sliced me down the middle, left hemisphere of the brain, right hemisphere of the brain. There's generally 2 major connection points of the left to the right and vice versa sections of, or hemispheres of our brain. And then within each hemisphere, each lobe and different sections of the lobes, we have different connections there as well that just communicate with each other. And as the shows go on, you'll see how the function of each of those lobes is extremely intertwined, and how one area of the brain affects another, and affects another. So you can stimulate one area, which then downstream 3 or 4 different areas downstream in the brain, just by affecting one area of the brain that's more upstream, you can have a beneficial or even a negative effect on other areas of the brain. That's called functional neurology. This next picture that you see on the screen, we want to talk about that aspect of where in certain areas of our brain we feel something and where in certain areas of the brain we have direction or motor activity. And this is very interesting, I think, and I think you'll find it interesting as well. There is an aspect in the parietal lobe called the primary sensory strip. And let's look at that on the screen. That's the one on the left that's kind of shaded in blue. Now we got to look real hard here. You see on the very far left, on the bottom, we have it's actually an illustration of a tongue. Then the teeth is right above that, and then you see a face of a person. Then as you continue to go up towards the top, you see a thumb and some fingers, a hand, an arm, and then aspects, a very small aspect towards the top, an aspect of our trunk of our body. Then you see the leg that goes up, the knee, and then the lower leg and the foot that comes down. Now what I want to impress upon you in this area here, folks, is in this figure, that is showing an area of our brain that is primarily dedicated to feeling something in those areas of our body. Now, if we go back to that figure, you can see that the tongue on the bottom left, the teeth in the face, the thumb and the fingers and the hand, they physically take up a lot more space in that part of the brain than compared to, let's look back at it again, the trunk, which is at the top, the trunk of our body, from our neck on down to our tops of our thighs. It's a very small part of that part of our brain that is actually the map. It's a very small section of our brain that is dedicated to allowing us to feel something in that region. Then you have the leg and down to the foot. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that there are aspects of our brain, actual surface area, amount of sections of our brain, that the more that we have dedicated actual surface area oftentimes, especially when we talk about this ability to feel something, a touch, the more surface area is dedicated in our brain to that area, the more precise that touch and feel is going to be. And the same holds true for the amount or the ability to move different things. Now, I'm going to touch on that here in just a second again. Let's go back to the picture. On the right-hand side, it's kind of a pinkish kind of a color there. You see, it's just the opposite. You see in the top, the foot that's down in the middle part of the brain aspect right there, the leg that comes up, the thigh aspect, the trunk's very small, the hand and fingers are very large, the face is very large, and the tongue is pretty large. Now, that is the directive or movement part of our brain, the primary motor strip it's called, primary movement area that initiates that movement. Now, the face covers a lot of surface area, the tongue covers a lot of surface area, our hand and fingers covers a lot of surface area compared to everywhere else. Well, if you think about it, our tongue itself, we have to be able to move it very specifically to be able to talk, to keep it away from our teeth as we're chewing. You don't even think about that, do you? Unless you bite your tongue, and that's a good little segue. Your tongue hurts. It hurts a lot when you have it pinched or you bite it. The reason it's very sensitive that way, the reason our face is very sensitive, how we can have all these kinds of different contortions of our face, is it has a lot to do with the amount of surface area that is dedicated in the brain to that part of our body. Our hands, we have to be very precise with our fingers, much more precision-like than our shoulder or even our toes. And you can remember that our hands and fingers, a lot more surface area than our feet and toes did or have. So generally speaking, in these primary sensation areas of the brain and primary movement, we'll call it, sections of our brain, there's a lot of surface area dedicated to that because we gotta utilize those a lot more. Now, let's go back to as we were developing embryologically. One of the reasons why those areas of the brain have a lot of surface area to them is because we've just ended up using that area a lot. So let's go back to the part where I talked about using something, okay, or sensation, excuse me, whether it's through taste or the tongue, talking, utilizing the tongue, facial expressions, utilizing our hands a lot for different grasping things, and etc. Using that over the millions of years has developed more of that part of the brain. So the basic thing that I want you to grasp here is just that. Oftentimes, the more we use something, no matter what it is, the more that kind of develops a certain aspect of our brain, because all of those sensations eventually go to a certain part of our brain to keep it more activated and the more that it can kind of grow and become more functional.